Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Milestones podcast. I am your host, Shelby Dennis of Milestone Equestrian, and I'm trying my hand at pre-recording podcast episodes and queuing them. So you may just yet get a regular podcast uploading schedule, but do not quote me on this or hold me to it because it really depends on how organized I'm feeling. And sometimes the ADHD demon within me is just going to light my whole life on fire and just not accomplish that. So I'm going to do my best when I'm feeling productive and record as many podcast episodes as I can. And this topic that I wanted to do is a very timely one, in my opinion, because we're heading into fall, winter, and that is the time where we start to see hay prices go up because obviously hay is not being cut through the fall and winter. So prices go up. There's not grass to have horses out on. So people have to feed hay, and all in all, like the general cost of caring for horses go up. So it's usually around this time of year that you see an influx of ads for horses who are unwanted and being offered for free to good home on horse sales pages. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this is that I think it's a really important topic, and it goes a lot deeper than just the unwanted horse, because I wanted to discuss the topic of giving your horse a good death. And this also applies to any animal also. It's not just for horses, but with horses in particular, there's this type of mindset in the horse industry where if a horse is not useful to be ridden, that in order for the person who owns that horse to get a rideable horse that they can use, that it's acceptable to just perpetually be rehoming horses. Horses are viewed as a lot more replaceable than dogs are. And unfortunately for the horse, it's a lot more socially acceptable to just rehome horses indefinitely. I'm not sure where this stat comes from, so as for the validity of it, I can't really speak for it, but the average horse apparently goes through around 7 homes throughout their life. To me, honestly, that seems on the low end, especially if we're referencing race horses or horses that are like show horses that are being leased out or sold. It's probably more than that. But the fact of the matter is the average horse is going to be going through several homes in their life. It is very, very uncommon to find horses who have been within the same home their entire lives. Like, that is almost unheard of. And yes, horses live for a long time, but when we're comparing it to dogs, dogs get rehomed and abandoned as well. And this isn't to downplay the unwanted dog problem or the unwanted cat problem, but it's a lot less socially acceptable to try to pawn off your dog who is ailing in health and elderly, or even if they're not old, has some type of physical or otherwise health problem that makes them less desirable. If you were to do that, you would be met with a lot more scrutiny, and it's a lot less defended than it is to do it with horses, because we also see people justifying rehoming horses if you don't click with them. And this isn't to say I'm against rehoming horses. I always want to preface this because people like to add context that is not there with things that I say. And I just want to reiterate the fact that, like, as a neurodivergent person, I very much try to only say exactly what I mean. So if I don't explicitly say I am against the sales of horses, I don't mean it. But my point is that people will rehome horses for an abundance of reasons, such as not clicking with the horse, even if the reasons that they are not clicking with that horse are because of them, because of their riding, because of their inflexibility, because of the horse's poor management creating problems. The horse is then the one that has to take the responsibility of being rehomed and have to deal with all of the aftermath of that and constantly adjust to new people, new environments, and not really being fully seen or heard. So I think as a general rule, it'd be safe to say that a lot of people are far too freely rehoming horses without care and without real understanding of how difficult it is for horses to go from place to place, because all of these different places have different expectations and everyone handles horses differently. And the horse is just expected to adjust to those different circumstances pretty much perfectly, or if they don't, then their behavior is usually blamed on them. And that is a completely different issue from the unwanted horse problem, because that applies to all types of horses who are being rehomed, no matter how desirable they are. So the horse could be a very nice, very accomplished show horse. If a rider doesn't click with them, or if they quote unquote outgrow them, they're then going to be moved on to another home where there can be different expectations or different ways of riding. And the people could effectively be using different cues, and the horse may not answer to them as well. And then the horse is blamed, or sometimes the previous owner is blamed. Or if management is changed, for example, if a horse is going from 24/7 turnout to being stalled most of the time and their behavior changes as a result, you also will see people trying to blame the previous home and be like, they lied, they drugged the horse or whatever, or blame the horse. And we're just not taking into account all of the factors that can alter horses' behavior, and also how hard on them it is to be constantly moved from home to home. And I think that's something that we really need to factor in. But my primary focus for this episode is going to be on rehoming horses who are more undesirable and specific. Before I go into this, I want to say that I personally do not any longer subscribe to the mindset that a horse has to be rideable to be worthy of a home or useful or have their owner's desire to keep them. However, at one time when riding was a major priority of mine, if my horse had gotten an injury that rendered them unable to compete at the level that I wanted to eventually get to, it would have been a problem where I would have likely justified rehoming them. And there is one case I can use for myself personally with this as an example. I'm not going to liken it to the degree of the issues that I'll be discussing today because the horse was not unrideable. But with my off-the-track thoroughbred Dallas many years ago, he strained his stifle. And while it was supposed to be a pretty cut and dry rehab process, he didn't come back being like 100% where I would be comfortable jumping him again. However, he was sound for riding and cleared by the vet and technically cleared to jump, but I just really there's something in my gut that was like, do not jump this horse. However, at that time, I really wanted to jump. So even though I really loved this horse, I did rehome him. And it's a case now where if the same thing happened now, I would have handled it differently and I would have kept him, but I'm in a way different headspace and also just ability space now than I was back then. So anyways, I rehomed him for a flat riding home only, and I was given two offers. I was offered the full purchase price that I was asking for him, which was only $1,200 because I only wanted him to go to a flat home. And then I was offered $400 from a family who just wanted a horse as a companion for their other horse, maybe some light trail riding and like a lifelong home. And I got way better vibes from the lower offer. And the reason why their offer was lower was because they were initially like looking at local rescues and were just wanting to get a horse in need, that the local rescues didn't have anything that they were looking for. So I ended up selling him to them, and he's been there ever since. And it was one of the best decisions I've made in that moment because they were able to provide for him a life that I couldn't at the time. He got way better herd turnout and has lived like a very nice, easygoing life. And I'm still in contact with him. I can still go visit him when I'm in the area. And I don't regret that decision at all. However, it's a situation where if I hadn't been as careful, or if I had been deceived by a potential buyer, that he could have ended up in a not so good place. So with horses like that, where they are still able to find a home, because in his case, he was like a really easygoing, easy to handle horse. So that also was in his favor. If he was a really difficult, hot, and challenging horse, finding a rider who was able to manage him, but not going to push him too hard and would actually want to keep him for as long term as he has been, because it's been over a decade that he's been in this home, like that would have been way harder. So that's an instance where I did do something similar to what I'm going to be discussing. However, I wanted to discuss like other options and kind of how I would weigh the pros and cons now. And also just kind of go over the fact that like these types of homes, like the type of home that I lucked into finding for him is like a very unusual find, especially for them to keep him as long as they'd have. A lot of people would have resold the horse sooner for one reason or another, be it because of economic status or wanting a different type of horse or whatever, right? So he was very fortunate that he went to people who owned the property that they kept the horses at and have lots of access to space and who are very much just enjoying keeping horses as companions without any attachment to riding them specifically. So he really lucked into that type of home. So while homes like that are out there, there's not enough of them to accommodate anywhere close to the level of demand for these unwanted horses that are unrideable or injured. And also in Dallas's case, he was very young when I rehomed him. I think he was only like 7 or 8. So he has a lot of years of life past that he's going to need a home for. And while I did put in the contract that if he ever is needed to find a home, that I have first right of refusal, that's very hard to uphold in court. If by chance they ever did need to rehome him, I would take him back in a heartbeat. But anyways, I just wanted to give that as an example because I know people who don't like me would try to bring that up to be like, you're such a hypocrite. But I also want to point out the fact that I was 18 at the time that happened. And if your perspectives on how you have handled things do not change at all in a decade, you're not doing enough growing. As an 18-year-old kid who didn't really know what I wanted at that point, I made a decision that's not in line with the person I am now. And it's not one I regret because it did turn out well, but I want to use that as an example to also clarify that like what I found for him is very, very unusual, especially in the area that I live in where land is limited and land is also very expensive. But the specific issue that I want to talk about is with horses that aren't even rideable for light riding, or if they are, like, it's like lead line riding with a kid on them, like not even trail riding and stuff, like they're damaged or they're not rideable at all. And this is the time of year you tend to see these types of horses available because they're the first horses that people want to get rid of when they don't want to or cannot afford the hay costs. So you see these ads that are like senior, very kind elderly horse, like 20 plus years old, unsound to ride due to navicular or arthritis or XYZ reason, but very sweet, easy to handle, lovely companion horse, looking for companion home only, free to good home. Or if they're a younger horse, it'll be something along the lines of like 6-year-old, beautiful, stunning and sweet horse, lovely to handle, great companion, great with other horses, unable to be ridden because of an injury that they sustained either in riding or as a youngster or whatever. It doesn't really matter. They're just not rideable and free to good home. Or sometimes they might put like a small purchase price on the horse, but the fact of the matter is that it's usually very flexible and they're just looking for them to go get rehomed. And then there's also people who post these ads in a more blunt manner where they don't even specify that they're looking for a good home. They'll just say like that they need the horse gone before winter. And you also see this happen a lot, like, and this is not to throw anyone under the bus. So if there's anyone local that's listening to me say this and it applies to you, I'm not necessarily thinking of you. This is just a phenomenon that I've seen online a lot because I follow a lot of horse accounts where someone will get a horse that's like a really promising prospect and they'll put a lot of time and energy into training it, start competing it, and things will be going well. And then the horse will sustain a career-ending injury, or they'll find some type of issue that the horse always had, like severe kissing spine or something. And then they will try to get rid of the horse. I think it's worse when it's an injury that the horse sustained in their training program. And then despite the fact that they are the one that lamed the horse, they want to rehome the horse now because they don't want to, they want to get a rideable horse and they can only afford one horse. And then they kind of pawn this horse off onto someone else when they're effectively less desirable than they would have been prior to being put into that program. And it's even worse when the issue is such that the horse cannot be ridden because, like, let's be real, most people want horses for riding. Unrideable horses cost the same as rideable ones. So when a lot of people are looking to buy a horse for the first time, their preference naturally is one that they could use for riding, even if it's very occasionally. So having a horse that's injured that costs the same amount of money and might need special care isn't something that most people are looking for when they're looking to get a horse. So the way I see it is if the person who has had the horse for however much time has trained it for a purpose and kept it and developed this relationship with it. And a lot of people would say that this is like their heart horse or that they love the horse or whatever. If that person doesn't care enough about the horse to keep the horse into retirement when they're no longer desirable or useful, why would a stranger? And this isn't to negate the fact that there are some very kind-hearted strangers who have room in their barns and their hearts to take on these horses, but they are not the normal. They're an exception to the rule, and there's very few of them, which is why there's so many unwanted horses. And those people are great. But the fact of the matter is, if the person who knows the horse well and who has had a chance to develop a relationship with the horse doesn't care enough to take care of them when they no longer are desirable, the odds of someone else who's never even met the horse, gotten to know their personality and develop a bond with them, the odds of a person like that wanting to take the horse on when they could take on other horses who are free to good home or very cheap that do not have the same problems, very slim. Because that's the other thing is at all these auctions for horses shipping to slaughter and whatnot, there's tons of sound horses. There's tons of sound, nicely put together horses who, while they may be unhandled or may have had abuse issues or trauma, and while you are taking a gamble by getting them because you don't really get to know that much about them before you have to commit to purchasing at an auction, there's a lot of sound horses that are good prospects that you could take on at an auction that are not the lame and problematic ones. So even if you're going into a situation like an auction, there's better options available if you want something that has less problems. So when we're looking at these unwanted horses, it's like, why would people want them? And this is where I think it's going to go into the discussion of like a good death, because I think that part of our responsibility as owners is knowing when to let go. And I know euthanasia is a really tough subject, so maybe a minor trigger warning for people who are sensitive to that. But what I really want to emphasize in all of this is that animals in general, they don't sit around thinking of the future and like fearing their impending death. They don't spend time pondering their mortality in the way that humans do. The only time that they're going to really fear death is if they're actually put in a position that life is in danger. And the fixation on euthanasia is this really bad, dirty word by so many horse people where they put quantity of life above quality of life fails to actually account for how horses are feeling. So for example, when we're training horses in highly stressful ways where they're fearing for their lives and feel like they are in danger and like they're being attacked by a person and like the human is a predator in their life, in those moments, they're fearing for their lives. And yet a lot of the same people who advocate against euthanizing horses that are able to live in theory, but again, not without support of a home. A lot of the people who advocate against euthanasia are condoning certain training methods that are actually actively making horses fear death. So it's a very contradictory stance that we see in the horse world, because a lot of the training methods that are still condoned, a lot of the things that are allowed and enabled at the upper levels actually actively make horses feel fear for their safety and their longevity in a way that euthanasia never will unless they have a reason to have that fear. And there's ways where we can bring them a timely and kind and compassionate end where they're not going to have that fear. And it's not going to be the sustained, like prolonged terror that a lot of horses experience in their day-to-day lives for months or years on end because of how they are trained. So animals don't fear death the way humans do. And we often project our own fear of mortality onto the animals around us when really what we love most about animals, at least for me, is the fact that they live in the moment. They're non-judgmental. They're not plotting against you. They're not pondering the complexities of life in the way that humans are. They live in the moment and they're very present in the moment. So it's almost a meditative environment to be around horses because they have a tendency to put you in the moment. But if the moment of their lives is stressful and crappy, that is the reality of their life. And if that is sustained for days, weeks, or months, or years on end, that is what their life is comprised of. They're not going to be like thinking back to the good old days where things were happier. They're going to be miserable in the moment. So we need to look at the moments of their life and whether or not those moments are comprised of things that are worth living through. And if you have a horse who is elderly and lame and unrideable, who has grown comfortable and used to living in the home that you provided for them and is now being put up for free on Facebook Marketplace, that stressor of leaving the relative safety of an environment that they've grown used to and effectively being thrown to the wolves where you don't know where they're going to end up and where they might not have and are likely not going to have the same level of compassion and understanding. Because again, these unwanted horses, even if the people who take them on have good intentions, they're usually the first to go when they can't keep as many horses or when they run out of hay or whatever. And you're essentially playing Russian roulette with your horse's life. When if you don't want to keep them and you don't want to retire them and you don't want to put the money into doing it, in my opinion, it's the responsibility of the owner to give them a good death rather than putting their life up for lottery, essentially, and running a huge risk of the horse ending up somewhere where they're not going to be properly cared for. Because the other thing is that all of the value for these types of horses is in their meat price. That's where they're most valuable. So if you got people who are just looking to make a quick buck, or even if they don't want the horse to ship to slaughter, but they need money and they're just going to drop them off in an auction and kind of gaslight themselves into thinking that a nice home will buy them, they'll do that and they'll pocket the money that they get and like not care about where the horse goes. So by putting these horses up for free on and like just pawning off the issue onto another person, the people who own these horses are just evading accountability for their own decisions. They are evading accountability for like what care they're meant to provide for that horse, and they're pawning off that responsibility onto someone else to preserve their own feelings and ego. It's a very selfish decision that's all about preserving their own comfort, because if it was not about that, then you would take on the responsibility and go, this horse is not desirable. They've lived a good life, and the odds of them ending up somewhere terrible and not having a good end are far too high if I put it up to someone else to take them on because they are lame and unrideable or have whatever issue it is, or they're really elderly and senior and they need specialized care. And there's just not enough homes out there that want to take on horses with health issues. And that doesn't make it fair, but that's the reality of the situation in the horse world. So what I think is a lot of people feel guilty about the idea of euthanizing a horse, because when you make that decision, you have to own up to the fact that you have made the decision to euthanize the horse so that you can go and get another sounder horse in a lot of cases. Not everyone who does this is doing it to get another horse, but if that's the primary motivator behind it, especially with these young and injured horses, then you're choosing to end the life of a horse that in theory could live a comfortable life as a companion animal so that you can buy a riding horse. And that forces you to sit with the reality that you value riding above that horse's life. And there's no way around that. And I'm not saying this in a judgy way, but like that is why people do this, to try to evade the guilt. Because I think that giving a horse a good death is preferable to having the horse be resented or pawned off onto other people, or rolling the dice and just like hoping that the horse will find a soft landing, right? So, but like that is why a lot of people would prefer to just pawn off the issue onto someone else and give the horse quantity of life over quality. Because if they make the decision to euthanize, then one, you're going to meet outside judgment from other horse people for sure because of how euthanasia is perceived in the horse world. But two, you're also going to have to deal with the internal judgment of your own conscience going, you chose to euthanize this horse so you can go get a shiny new horse. That really puts into perspective how horse people value riding and competition above the lives of their horses in a lot of cases. And the same honestly applies to like when people are like, I've outgrown the talents of this horse, I'm going to sell them and get another horse. If the relationship you built with that horse who is less talented was actually what takes precedence, then the climbing up the levels of competition wouldn't take precedence above having that horse in your life, because you'd want to have them in your life just as your friend and your lower level riding horse. But because competition and riding and moving up the levels of that is what is so important to a lot of people, even though they love the horse, what they love more is the ability to compete. And again, not a judgment, because those types of horses can still find good homes and they can go on to teach other people how to ride and end up in homes that'll keep them into retirement and really appreciate them. But speaking as someone who used to do that very thing, that really is what it is. Because with my dog, for example, I don't have her to do dog sports or because she's talented at any specific thing. She's my friend. She's poorly conformed. She has hip dysplasia and she's dog reactive and nervous of people, and is kind of challenging to have around because I have to be careful what circumstances I bring her into, because she's a very anxious dog. And she's not one of the types of dogs that I can just show up to at a party full of other people and other dogs and have her be comfortable. It's too anxiety inducing for her and she doesn't like it. So she's a more high maintenance dog to have around, but she's my friend, so I keep her around. If she stops being able to go on long hikes with me and stuff, it wouldn't change the fact that I still want to have her around because she's my friend. But with most horses, it's very different from that, where their usefulness and the love that people have for them is really tied to their ability to use them to achieve their dreams, like as a vehicle to achieve their dreams. So we kind of shine a spotlight on that in a really stark and obvious way when someone has to make the decision between keeping and retiring a horse that they cannot ride or euthanizing it so they can get another horse. And by putting that horse up for free to good home and having someone else take it and gaslighting themselves into thinking they've found this unicorn style retirement home to send this horse off to, they get to evade the guilt that would come with making that decision otherwise. And they get to pretend that they've made the better decision regardless of where that horse ends up. So it saves their feelings oftentimes at the expense of the horse. Because the other thing too is that, like, if people put aside money to save for like retirement for horses or whatever, there's homes that you can send the horse to where you can pay to board them and get full care, where you don't even need to go visit them if you don't want to. And you can ship your horse up to somewhere further away that's cheaper to keep them, and you can retire that horse for life in that area. Now, you have to do your due diligence, because some of these places do not do the level of care that they claim to, but there's a lot of places that are very good and that do all those things that you could pay to have the horse at if you don't want to retire them and keep them in your immediate vicinity where it might be more expensive. So that's an option for retiring them. Choosing to retire the horse doesn't always have to be between choosing to get another rideable horse or keeping the lame horse, if people properly prepare. But all of that aside, like, the sense of entitlement that people have to rideable horses coming above the well-being of horses is an ethical problem. And while people can argue until they're blue in the face that euthanizing a horse that could be comfortably retired out on pasture and just live out its life like that is a selfish decision, it's a far better decision by just then throwing these horses into the sales pens and hoping someone else takes on that responsibility. And we can argue about it being selfish or whatever, but for the horse, all that matters is that their suffering is stopped, that they have a good death. And that's why that's something I'll advocate for. Do I think it is a good look when someone lames their young horse, euthanizes it, and then goes on and buys another horse when the horse's lameness that they euthanized was not such that they couldn't live a comfortable life on pasture? And when you see the person spending tons of money on A-rated shows and tack and whatnot, and it seems like they could have afforded to retire that horse. No, I don't think it's the best look. I think it looks selfish, but it's preferable to them giving away a horse that's highly likely to go to auction and end up on the slaughter pipeline. But that's kind of the situation the horse industry's in. And we can talk about how horses need to be viewed as less of a commodity and how we need to be more sensitive of their needs and prioritize them above being able to use them for riding. And all those things are true and important, but that's not where the horse world is at right now. So euthanasia is a very viable alternative to having these horses live in undesirable circumstances and being put in situations where they are highly likely to end up somewhere bad. And instead of leaving it up to strangers, because if you don't care as the person who's built a relationship with that horse, a stranger is highly unlikely to. So it's a really tough subject, but I do think that it needs to be had. Passing off your unwanted horse to be someone else's problem instead of giving them a humane ending might feel more noble to you because it extends their life by a little bit, but it doesn't factor in the quality of life or whether or not it's fair to the horse. Horses going from home to home and perpetually being the second-class citizens in those homes because they're not rideable, that's not kind. They're not as easy to rehome. They're not as desirable by other humans. So they're more likely to be the end that's cut loose when people don't want to keep as many horses. And people continuously evading accountability for care of horses and passing the horses off to be someone else's problem is not okay. It allows the people doing so to feel morally superior because they are keeping the horse alive and they think that's a kindness, but they're not considering whether or not that life is a life that's worth living. And they also aren't considering if it's condemning the horse to a life where they are going to be taken to auction and sold to a kill buyer at some point. And while that can happen with rideable, healthy horses because we see them at those auctions, they're a lot less likely to go. And you're increasing the likelihood of a horse ending up in that situation by a landslide when you do that to a horse who is injured or has some type of issue. And loving horses enough to love them through their lack of rideability, or at least giving them a humane end. If it's between that and pawning them off onto someone else and throwing them into a market that is already flooded with unwanted horses, many of which who are rideable, if it's between that, it should just be giving them a humane end. Like, you have to love them enough to put them first and their interests first above yours. And there are options outside of just giving them to someone else. And what I also want to reiterate is that what I'm saying here doesn't apply to people who know someone personally in their life that has already offered to take on a horse for retirement or whatever. If there's people within your circle that you know well and who you can vouch for the integrity of that are willing to take a horse on, and you're not like publicly advertising them to the masses, that's a lot different. And that can just be part of like a retirement plan. So I think that people need to be more honest with themselves about what they're actually doing and what their choices are putting horses at risk of. Letting elderly horses pass in the homes they've known for so long instead of throwing them out into a new environment when they can no longer be ridden is not okay. Another issue is that I see lesson barns use up lesson ponies to the point where they're no longer rideable or useful in lessons, and they try to pawn off their retirement onto someone else. I think that is horrible because they have kept the business afloat with their services. And at the very, very, very least, what that facility owes them is a good death instead of just making them someone else's problem. If we're being completely honest, I think that they owe them a retirement where they can have some life where they're not having to work a job. But if it's between being rehomed to somewhere else when they are no longer desirable and they've had like every drop of their riding usefulness squeezed out of them, or euthanizing them, I would always pick euthanizing them. So the fact of the matter is, if you don't love the horses that you spent years bonding with enough to keep them through their less desirable stages of life, why would a stranger do that for you? And why should you expect them to? Winter is coming, especially with senior horses. It's harder to keep weight on them, and they can be very expensive to keep. So don't throw your damaged horses to the wolves. Part of owning horses is caring enough about them to give them a good end. If you feel like a bad person for euthanizing because you know that retiring them would be the kinder option, that's a sign that you should buck up and keep them into retirement, or deal with that internal guilt and ask why it's present, not just play Russian roulette with the horse's quality of life and try to give them to someone else. Because maybe there's a reason you should feel like a bad person in that situation, you know? Like, sometimes our conscience is leading us to higher learning, and the guilt that we feel is a sign that we might want to lean into other ways of doing things. So the sad truth is that there's not the amount of kind and caring homes available for these types of horses that people are making it out to be. As a whole, horses, whether they're rideable or not, are sold and purchased way too much for really unfair reasons, where like people will take on a horse that is way too much horse for them. And like there was signs that was the case prior to the purchase, and then they just pawn the horse off onto someone else, or like worse, they'll lame the horse in their programs and then pawn the horse off to someone else. And it's just a big problem. And like, I also speak for this as someone who works in horse sales, and I still do help source homes for horses retiring from racing, and I still do help take on commission horses and help rehome them. And I still will occasionally take on project horses to rehab behaviorally and then find homes for. But I've learned the hard way that doing that in a way where you're actually making it a good business practice, where you're not just breaking even or where you're not losing money, it's very hard to do that in a way that is ethical to the horse. And that's kind of why I've really stepped back from doing that as often, and why like even projects like Mesa that I got where the intent was to sell them, like she's staying for the foreseeable future now, unless a really special home comes up, because that horse has taken such a long time to really start trusting people that I don't want to uproot her life again and just send her off to like some new home when she's finally just started getting comfortable around people and really started to trust and like has gotten used to the herd that she's in. Like, it would be a really horrible thing to do that unless it was like the perfect situation and she's further along in her journey. So now at this point, I'm like 2 years into having her and she's not looking like she's getting sold anytime soon, despite the fact that like that was my plan with getting the Mustangs, is to have them as sales projects. But that's, or like at least one of them, which is Mesa. That's not the way that things are working out because it's not fair to her. And then we also have my mom's horse, Pogo, who got diagnosed with kissing spine this past summer. I figured he was likely to at least have spinal processes that were close. And when we had the vet out to do some other stuff for horses, I had them snap some slides of his back just so that we could see. And he's not been in work really the last while. And unfortunately, he has kissing spine, which is like, I was very much unsurprised. Like, before the x-rays got shot, I told my mom, I was like, just be prepared for it to like be news that it's going to be hard to hear. Cause I was like, I'd be very surprised if he doesn't have like kissing spine. So now we're dealing with that. And right now he's just chilling as a pasture pet. We're going to start to do some kissing spine rehab and just see how it goes and see how comfortable he can get. But like, ultimately, it's like, he's never going to be the trail horse that we had hoped he'd be so good at because he's such a quiet horse, because it's not fair for him to have to pack weight for such a lengthy period of time. He's never going to be a horse who's like jumping big jumps or doing like any big things. At most, he's going to end up being like a little plodding around farm horse for kids and doing like really small little rides if he does get ridden, or he's just going to be a pasture puff. But under no circumstances is he going to be sold. If it came down to it where I had to get rid of all of my horses, or for whatever reason we couldn't continue to care for him, he would be getting euthanized for sure, because I'm not putting him into a situation where he would ever be publicly offered up to people. Or like, I would use my close inner circle to be like, does anyone want a really friendly pasture pet? And in that case, I still likely wouldn't sell him. It would be like a free lease so that I retain ownership and therefore control of him. That's absolutely not the plan, but I'm just theorizing, like, if these things were to come up, like, he would be a horse who'd be a candidate for euthanasia for sure, because it just would be completely unfair to roll the dice and just offer him up to strangers who I don't know and put him into the sales market that's already flooded with tons of horses that have similar problems and worse than him. And he's more marketable than some horses are because he's just so quiet and easygoing, and he's a pretty easy keeper. But then we have these horses who aren't quiet, who aren't easygoing, and who aren't easy keepers that are also riddled with issues that make them less desirable. And like, that's the thing, is like, I want to open up this discussion to kind of make euthanasia less of a dirty word, because there's so many cases where I wish people would have just euthanized horses instead of like putting them into situations that are like unfair to them. Like, even in Milo's case, if it was between him starving those first 2 years of his life or being euthanized as a baby, as soon as the people were like, we can't afford to feed these horses, I would prefer him to have not had to have gone through the trauma that he did, because it's really affected him even now that he's 12. And it's like been a decade since he was in that circumstance. Since it was in such a developmental stage of his life, it's really impacted him. And I wish he didn't have to go through that. And the same applies for a lot of horses who are being neglected or mistreated. If we look at like their daily suffering and like how long it goes on for and how much the horse is struggling during that, if you had to choose between that daily suffering or doing a humane euthanasia, the euthanasia is pretty much always going to come out on top as the more ethical option when you account for just like the high degree of suffering that the horses are going through. So that's just some food for thought. And if you're ever in this situation where you need to do a euthanasia, be it for like a physical reason or a behavioral reason, like, just understand the fact that like the animal that you're euthanizing, all they know is they're present. So if they don't have to live in fear, trauma, or pain for a lengthy period of time, and you're just giving them a good death, regardless of the reason of it, if it's a peaceful death, to the animal, all their life was comprised of was what it was leading up to that. And then they get to have a peaceful death. And as far as euthanasia goes, there's ways that we can peacefully euthanize horses. Everyone kind of has their piece on whether or not they prefer like a gunshot method or like euthanasia by lethal injection. And like for me personally, like I've never had a horse shot. And even if it was a very ethical means of doing it, which it can be done, absolutely. But some people shoot in the wrong location and then it is not. But for me, selfishly, like just the nature of having to see that is not something I would want to go through. So I do sedation and then lethal injection. And I would always sedate first, always, because then they really don't know what's happening. And that's what we did with George, is sedation and then lethal injection. Because in his case, it wasn't because he was going to get rehomed or anything. Like, he could not go on living, and that was why. And even in his case, like, I wish I had euthanized sooner. But hindsight's 2020, and there was a chance he could have bounced back with treatment, but he didn't. And I wish that I had made the decision to euthanize him earlier, because it was very traumatic seeing him have to go through what he had to in his last moments. And he did suffer, even if it was just for like a few hours. There was suffering before his euthanasia because he laid down and then couldn't get back up. And that is a regret that I have. I wish that I had euthanized sooner, and it's changed my perspective on euthanasia. But then there's always like the what if the horse would have been treatable and fine and you euthanize them? Like, that can plague you too. So it's not to say that it's ever going to be an easy decision, but I would just encourage everyone to look at it through the mindset of their animal, living in the moment. Like, what do their moments look like? What are you risking those moments becoming if you are to rehome them to an unknown entity? And what is your capacity to help them if you give up ownership of them and sell them to a stranger? Because strangers, even if they offer to stay in contact with you, they can just peace out and not do that and just sell the horse to the auction, make a quick buck after getting the horse from you for free, and then never contact you again. So in a lot of cases, like if you do find the unicorn style home for your unrideable horse, retaining ownership is maybe the way that you want to go. Because another thing too is, even if the horse doesn't get sold to a kill buyer, people are liable to drug them up with painkillers or injections to cover up whatever the lameness is and just continue working them, especially if the horse was a pretty nice horse beforehand. There's a lot of incentive to do shady things, and sometimes the safest thing you can offer your horse for long-term care and help is just to give them a good death. And the same applies to other animals too. I know with dogs, like a lot of owners who deal with dogs that have behavioral problems may be put in a position where they have to consider behavioral euthanasia. And that's also a pretty hot topic in the dog industry, where there's a lot of really controversial and passionate opinions on it. And it's a really hard decision to make. But again, it's like the same thing. If your dog is so anxious and reactive that they cannot live a good and healthy life, and that they're constantly stressed and that they're a liability to themselves, other dogs, or people, what they are experiencing is in the moment. How many good moments are they having versus the bad? And how high is the risk to other people and animals? And that's really, again, what we should be looking at, rather than anthropomorphizing the situation to the point where people are like, oh, like, you're killing them, you're a murderer, you're so awful. Because it's like, why is giving them a peaceful end viewed as a greater issue than giving them a life that is just completely riddled with stress, anxiety, and pain? Because I don't see how that's any more noble. And like, the sad thing is, in a lot of animal industries, people are applauded just for keeping animals alive when they are suffering for whatever reason, instead of giving them a good death. And the important caveat for this is, like, horses who are on stall rest for injuries that are totally healable, there's going to be a period of relative suffering where their life is going to be less enjoyable, and like, they're not having the freedoms that they should as a horse. But if they're going to heal, it is part of the process of rehab and healing, and it's understandable. However, if they are in a situation where it's going to be prolonged discomfort with no end in sight, that's where we need to start looking at, is it fair to keep this animal alive? So it's important to look at these situations with nuance, because it's not to say that, like, oh, if your animal ever experiences any ounce of suffering, you should just euthanize them. That's not the case, but it's like, is it prolonged suffering? What does the likelihood of them healing from this and coming back look like? And what is my capacity as their owner to actually help them through this? And make a decision based off of that, because that's what's in the best interest of the animal. Because again, they do not fear death so long as you don't give them a reason to. I would wager that more horses fear death because of training protocols than they do before being humanely euthanized, by far. Like the horses we watched at the Olympics the last few months were probably, a fair number of them were fearing for their lives because they felt in danger actively while they were in front of a global audience. And that's not to say we should just euthanize those horses, but it's just to make the point that horses don't fear death unless we give them a reason to. And there's a lot of things that are justified in training and care of them that cause them to do so. And people don't see a problem with that. But then humane euthanasia is like a hot button topic in the horse world when it really shouldn't be. And I know that it is a hard topic. It's never going to be like a happy one to have, and it's never going to be an enjoyable one. And there's always like lots of different shades of ethicality when it comes down to it, because yes, you can get people who are euthanizing willy-nilly so that they don't have to care for the animals that they're breaking down. But with that said, it's still giving that animal reprieve from a life that wouldn't necessarily serve them. And in some cases, people do euthanize animals that could otherwise find a good home and be completely fixable or whatever. So that's also not to take away from that euthanasia can also be done in a very selfish manner when the horse will be otherwise fine and when they would be desired for a home. But that's not always the case. And oftentimes when we're seeing these horses that are being listed for free to good home, especially throughout the winter, like, it's not a situation where the horse has people banging down the door to take them on. It's a situation where the owner is looking to like evade accountability for their inadequate care practices, or like their lack of desire to keep the horse in their care and pawn it off onto someone else. So like, I think nuance is important because not every euthanasia is going to be done with the horse's well-being in mind. However, even in those circumstances, if the animal is not made to like fear for their death leading up to it, it's still a lesser evil than a lot of the things that we normalize in horse training and care. So I don't know, difficult topic. I think it's important to look at these things with nuance and like just be understanding of the fact that like multiple things can be true at one time, and that ultimately all we can do is like our best, but part of doing our best is being accountable and not just like pawning off horses onto other people willy-nilly and not like answering to like what our decisions are actually saying. So yeah, it's frustrating to see, and it's also very normalized in horse show culture. And I think that's part of it, is that just the degree to which people are rehoming and like buying and selling horses who are healthy, that normalizes the doing so to the unhealthy ones. And it's just something to take into account. So anyways, thank you for listening, and let me know your thoughts on this podcast. And I really appreciate you listening again. So I hope this topic was interesting. And if anyone has any follow-up topics or unrelated topics that they would like me to cover in future podcasts, please let me know, because I always appreciate getting motivation, because sometimes I need it to kind of spark the desire to record these, and topic suggestions are super helpful. So thanks. Thank you so much for listening to the Making Milestones podcast. If you are interested in helping support the podcast, it would be so appreciated if you would consider reviewing it on whatever podcast provider you are listening on. Reviews help to boost the podcast in the algorithm and can help increase viewership, which helps me continue doing what I do here. Also, there's other ways you can support. If you look down below in the podcast description, you can see the Patreon channel where you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month to access behind-the-scenes content, training help, and more. All of these subscriptions help to continue the work associated with the podcast and more. You can also check out the shop page where you can buy Milestone Equestrian merch, equestrian apparel, or horse bridles. Alternatively, you can also check out the website milestoneequestrian.ca for free resources, paid webinars, and more. Your help is so appreciated, and without it, the podcast could not exist. So thank you again for listening and your support. If you would consider reviewing, liking, sharing the podcast episodes or any of our other links, or subscribing to Patreon, it would be immensely appreciated. Have an amazing day, and thank you again for your support. I look forward to seeing you again in the next podcast episode.